Welcome to the Science of Sports Performance, where we discuss the real science of nutrition and exercise, helping you train smarter, fuel better, and perform at your very best. My name is Ben Pressler, and I'm currently an undergraduate student at Brigham Young University, majoring in both nutritional and exercise sciences. I'm pursuing my PhD with the goal of becoming a professor of sports nutrition. The topic of our discussion today is going to be that of recovery and fatigue management. Now, obviously, all athletes, whatever sport or whatever emphasis you have if it's an endurance sport, if it's a more a strength sport or a skill sport, whatever, really to be the best that you can be, you want to be practicing or training or in the gym as much as possible. The more you can practice, the better you can get. However, obviously, the things that we do to train for our sport are going to be fatiguing. They're going to be pretty tiring. And so you don't really get much benefit out of going to the gym again unless you are recovered from your previous session and you are able to give it your best go. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. After a training session, after, lift at the gym, after, cardiovascular training for your sport, whatever it might be, what can we do as athletes to get back to our baseline so that we can go back, train more, or better yet, what can we do to recover from our training session so that when it comes to game day, we can perform at our maximum capability while still being able to practice as much as we can leading up to game day, race day, whatever that might be. So we're going to be talking about how to recover from your training so that you can move on either to game day, race day, or to the next training session, recovery tools. In today's episode, you can expect to learn about how we can measure the effectiveness of different types of recovery protocols. We are going to be talking how to refuel post-exercise, both in terms of carbohydrates and protein and electrolytes and water rehydration. We're also going to talk a lot about sleep here at the end, but then we're also going to talk about the effectiveness of recovery protocols, including things like massaging and the use of foam rollers, as well as extreme cold versus extreme hot temperatures, compression garments, certain over-the-counter drugs that you can use. And then at the very end of the episode, I'm going to kind of give you guys a protocol that I would recommend using, kind of tying in together everything that we will talk about in today's episode. Now, I want to start with a disclaimer, however, that the topics of this episode are going to be how can I just recover from, again, strength training, cardiovascular training, or practice. I'm going to be sore, I'm going to be tired, but I'm not going to be injured. We're not talking about necessarily injury recovery. Now, granted, a lot of the topics that we're going to be discussing in this episode can help with injury recovery. It's a lot of all the same principles. However, if you are injured and you're trying to recover from an injury, I'm not really the guy to talk to. Okay, so if that is the boat that you fall in, if you are injured, then you need to go talk to an athletic trainer. You need to go talk to a physical therapist or someone who has, medical training, and their focus and their job is on how can we help athletes recover from injury. So again, in all things this episode, or not this episode, in all things in this show, my goal is not to take unhealthy or injured people and make them healthy again, but we're just going to be focusing on tools for how can someone who is healthy, someone who's trying to become a high performer, how can somebody increase their level of health and their level of performance in that regard. So with that disclaimer out of the way, the first thing to talk about really is how can we decide if a recovery protocol is effective? And some things might come to mind for you already. Now, there are really four main topics that I want to cover in this section. They're going to be that of blood lactate or lactic acid and hydrogen ions, acidity, delayed onset muscle soreness. In the literature, you're going to see that written as DOMS, D-O-M-S, but that is just the feeling of muscle soreness. And of course, delayed onset, usually that's how it goes. It's not, immediately after your exercise or training or whatever. It's just delayed onset muscle soreness. The next is just your ability to perform as a measure of recovery effectiveness. And the last one's going to be inflammation. So let's start with blood lactate and hydrogen ions. So this is something that most athletes have probably heard of, terms that many of you probably use. However, it's something that I think most people don't actually understand correctly. And I put myself in this boat until just probably a year and a half ago was when I finally listened to a lecture about what, blood lactate and lactic acid actually is. And well, what happens is that we see an increase in lactate in the blood and in the muscle cell in conjunction with exercise. So it's reasonable to assume that exercise produces lactic acid, and that is what causes the feelings of soreness. However, it really is not the lactic acid itself or the lactate. Lactic acid and lactate are kind of the same thing, except an acid is able to donate a hydrogen ion, and then after that, we don't call it the acid, but we call it ate. It's called a conjugate base. So lactic acid, once it donates its hydrogen ion, becomes lactate, which is its conjugate base. However, it seems nowadays the physiology of it all is that lactic acid actually serves as a sort of a buffer, which means that there are other substances in the blood, other acids that are stronger acids perhaps, that are going to be contributing to these hydrogen ions. The presence of hydrogen ions is what we consider acidity. That is where we get the term pH. It is the power of hydrogen ions. Anyways, lactate itself necessarily is not really what's causing the muscle fatigue, but rather it seems that lactate and lactic acid are actually kind of trying to go in and clear us of other acidotic chemicals and substances. It's trying to manage the acidity of the cell. So the reason I bring that up is because sometimes people will use, lactate, blood lactate levels, muscle lactate levels, kind of as a principle of how you have recovered. And so once all of the lactate has been flushed out of the muscle, then you must have recovered. And that's just not a great measurement for fatigue, because really we can't say that that is what causes our fatigue and our soreness post-exercise. And so if you wanted to kind of think of the blood lactate and things as sort of a physiological baseline, then that's okay. I think we can do that. And, maybe it's a sign that, if we've recovered and we're at a physiological baseline again, well, it must mean that we have recovered. I think that could be the case, but there's also been science and data to show that even if, your muscle fibers themselves haven't really recovered, you haven't refueled, you're not really going to be able to perform as well as you could. Your blood lactate levels are still going to kind of return to baseline anyway. So it really is just, it's not a reliable measure for how effective a recovery technique is, if that kind of makes sense to you. So for those reasons, I think it's more effective to use other forms of recovery metrics. The next one I said is DOMS, the delayed onset muscle soreness. And really this is kind of synonymous just with pain, with fatigue. Now, in the muscles themselves, of course, muscles are very innervated. That's how they contract. However, muscles themselves don't actually have the type of nerve fibers that signal to the brain feelings of pain. And so muscle cells themselves don't feel pain. So for example, when in exercise physiology labs, they do a muscle biopsy, they will use like lidocaine to numb the skin so that there's no pain sensation in the skin. However, they don't have to put, lidocaine or anything into the muscle itself because it's not going to feel the pain. And really, the muscle cells just kind of have this feeling of soreness or fatigue or tightness, usually in response to changing levels of fluid balance, usually like an increase in pressure, sort of a swelling or an edema. Post-exercise is very common, and that can be why we feel, sore. However, the muscle soreness then, for that reason, is also kind of not going to be a very great metric for recovery capability, because it's not, some people think that their muscle soreness is that they're feeling all of the micro tears and the little bits of damage to their muscles that have occurred during exercise. And that's just not what muscle soreness means or indicates. And so if you are in pain and if you're experiencing muscle soreness, you're probably not going to be able to perform as well as you can, and therefore you're probably not recovered all the way. But that doesn't necessarily mean that when there's no muscle soreness, you are recovered or things like that, because there's also, learned effects of muscle soreness. So for example, an elite athlete who's done an exercise very consistently for a long period of time, I'm sure many of you listening have experienced something like this. If you try a new exercise, or maybe it's just an exercise that's not new to you, but you haven't done it in a long time, sometimes you just get really, really, really sore after that workout. Whereas, again, like I said, an elite athlete who is more accustomed to this exercise, they might get the exact same, sort of adaptations to that exercise. It could still be a very effective training session without them experiencing those same symptoms of muscle soreness. So does that mean that they're immediately recovered because they don't have muscle soreness? No. So I think that this muscle soreness is a component of recovery because it needs to be gone in a way for you to perform as best as you can. But again, it's not a great indicator of that muscle recovery. And so really what I think is the best indicator of, I have been using the term muscle recovery, but all sorts of recovery, is just your ability to perform. Now, that might sound maybe like it's a little too easy, or maybe it's intuitive. I don't know how you feel about me using this metric. It's just my favorite for recovery. But to kind of go back to even the muscle soreness, sometimes even if you are still a little bit sore, you might feel bad. Your perception of your exertion during exercise is going to be higher. It's not going to feel great. However, a lot of times, especially in resistance and strength training, even if you're a little sore, you can actually still perform the same. Sometimes that little bit of muscle soreness doesn't actually impact your recovery at all. Whereas if, the damage done to the cells and they is recovered, there's no more damage lingering around to these muscle cells. They have adapted, they have grown, and they have been refueled. Like with all that, the recovery process, you can say with a reasonable bit of certainty, is over. Your body's done recovering when you can perform the same way you did in the previous bout. Now, again, that's not going to necessarily be a golden rule. There's always some sort of, genetic variations, and some people might just be able to, perform at the same caliber over and over and over and over again while still, kind of not having recovered all the way, and that can lead up to injury or extreme amounts of fatigue that will kind of, cascade down on them all at the same time. So you need to be careful, but I think in most cases, if you're doing more than you should, if you haven't recovered properly when you're trying to go to another training session, for the vast majority of people, if you're not recovered, you're not going to be able to perform as well. And so, in my opinion, simply, performance capability is the best metric for the effectiveness of a recovery technique. The last one to mention is that of inflammation. And we're actually going to talk about this at a couple different points in this episode, but I don't really like inflammation as a measure of muscle recovery. And again, I've been saying muscle recovery, but all different sorts of recovery, just because, I think it could be a very, very useful metric to look at, if somebody's inflammation has gone down kind of on its own, then that could be very valuable. However, the body's inflammatory response is very, very easy to modulate, whether that is, to things like extreme cold or, anti-inflammatory drugs. And so just because we've modulated that inflammation and cut it down doesn't mean that we've recovered just because of that. And so inflammation could be good if there's not, these external factors that are going to greatly impact it. However, just because of the possibility for it to be changed so much by things that don't necessarily cause recovery in the cells and in the tendons and in the resynthesis of like glycogen stores, I just don't love it as a marker for recovery. So throughout this episode, I am going to be considering performance capability as the best metric for recovery. Now, as we are actually starting to talk about recovery, I want to start off by talking about nutritional tools and nutritional protocols for recovery, because if you don't have proper nutrition, you're really just not going to recover at all. Take protein, for example. Many people have heard of protein being, sort of the bricks that you use to build a house, the house being your body. They provide the tools and the materials for you to grow and for you to form. And, if you go to the gym and you work really, really hard on, say, your bench press and your chest and your triceps and your shoulders, get really good mechanical tension and they're all set up to grow. Well, if you can't recover from that, if you don't have the tools, the proteins, or the bricks to the house, if you will, to recover from that, then no recovery is going to happen at all. And in a lot of cases, you might actually just, be breaking yourself down if you are unable to feed your training properly to recover from it. So everything that we're going to discuss after nutrition, aside from sleep, of course, but, sort of the recovery interventions, like I mentioned, massaging and hot and cold, all those, what we're going to try and see is how they can increase recovery, on top of good nutrition and good rest. So that's kind of going to be our baseline or our control as someone who has good nutrition and good rest. Are there tools out there that they can use to recover even better if they take them on, or are they going to be better off just having good nutrition and good rest? Well, in terms of that good nutrition, the three things to talk about, as I mentioned before, are your carbohydrate consumption, your protein consumption, as well as your rehydration, both in terms of water and electrolytes. Now, let's start off with carbs. If you're an athlete, you should be eating carbs. That is kind of the plain and simple rule. Is it possible to be a ketogenic athlete? Yes, but your body is just very, very efficient at utilizing carbohydrates for energy. If you're trying to be the best performer that you can be, you need to be eating carbs, and you probably need to be eating more carbs than you think you do. Now, this discussion about carbs, be it in this episode or in other episodes that I have done or will do, as I'm talking about carbs for athletes, I am neglecting from my mind the concept of body composition. I am assuming, as I talk about carbs, that you have the body composition that you like. If you are trying to lose body fat, to manipulate your body composition for your sport, which is obviously very beneficial and desirable and necessary in a lot of regards, then yeah, you're definitely probably going to need to cut back on your carbohydrate consumption and try to utilize your own fat stores on your body for energy, just for the sake of, it will be that your health or be it just having an advantageous body composition for your sport. However, as we talk about carbs right now, we are going to be assuming that you have the body composition that you want. You're trying to eat at maintenance calories, and so you're going to be consuming carbs to your maintenance calories. From the literature, we can see that for optimal glycogen resynthesis post-exercise, now again, glycogen are long chains of glucose that are stored in the muscles themselves as well as in the liver. The glycogen in the muscles are going to be pretty much used for the muscle to be contracting. It's going to be used for energy in that muscle. It can kind of be shared across different muscles, but what's going to have to happen is it needs to break down and enter the bloodstream and be transported to the other muscle that's going to use it. So usually what happens, rather than breaking down muscle glycogen for use in other areas, is our body's going to break down liver glycogen for use in other areas and for managing our blood sugar. On the topic of blood sugar, if you haven't listened to episode 9, that was my conversation with Dr. Sam Scott, where we talk about implications for athletes who live with diabetes, more specifically type 1 diabetes. We talk a lot about blood sugar and carbohydrate consumption in that episode. It was a great conversation, and I highly recommend that you check that one out. According to the literature, the best guideline we have is to consume 1.2 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight every hour post-exercise for 4 to 5 hours. So to make our math easy, let's say someone is 100 kilograms or about 220 pounds. Then for optimum glycogen resynthesis post-exercise, they should eat 120 grams of carbs, which is about 480 calories, immediately after exercise, and then every hour for 4 to 5 hours. So that would be 5 or 6 meals containing about 120 grams of carbs. So that could be about 600 grams of carbs, which is a lot. But again, if you are a highly active athlete, you're trying to recover your glycogen stores as quickly as possible so that you can train again, especially if you're having like multiple training sessions in the same day, which I understand that most athletes may not necessarily do, at least high priority training sessions occurring multiple times in the same day. I know it's very common for some people to do a lift or to do a cardiovascular training session and then practice their sport later in the day. However, in that case, practicing is probably going to be your higher priority, and you're probably not going to, have the strength or the aerobic training be quite as high of a priority. Obviously, you should still fuel it and recover from it as best as you can, but you're really placing, in that case, more emphasis on the sport-specific training, doing our sport and getting better at that. Anyways, moving on. That is a lot of carbs, but that might just be exactly what we need, especially at these high levels. Now, that is a very optimal way to do it. Again, 1.2 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight per hour for 4 to 5 hours. The implication for that is really if you want to resynthesize your liver and muscle glycogen as quickly as you can. You want to be giving a fair dose of carbohydrate pretty regularly for several hours. However, if perhaps you are just doing a one important training session a day that you really want to have fueled properly and have the muscle glycogen that you need, muscle glycogen resynthesis can pretty reliably occur within about 24 hours. So if you have, like I said, one practice or training session that you do each day that really, really matters to you, you want to be really, really properly fueled for, as long as your total carbohydrate intake is going to be enough to resynthesize those glycogen stores, in 24 hours, you should be okay. However, if you're trying to recover, again, as quickly as possible and get these glycogen stores replenished as quickly as possible, then that's going to be our guideline. So again, it's a lot of carbs, but that's what you need. That's really, really, really what you need. There's implications for if you're trying to manipulate body composition, but again, we're not thinking about that in this case. We're just talking about how can I perform as best as I can in the future. Next, let's talk about protein. Now, there's lots of different statements and arguments, and a lot of logic goes into the question of how much protein do I need to be eating in a day? Frankly, I could make an entire podcast episode about this, and I'm sure that I probably will. But for the condensed version in this episode, my recommendation is going to be 0.8 to 1 grams of protein per pound of lean mass. Now, if you are pretty overweight, if you have a lot of fat that you're carrying around, you really don't need to consider that extra weight in terms of your protein requirement. You should be okay just to do like an ideal body weight, or if you want to do like your lean mass, your fat-free mass, then I would go to the 1 gram of protein per pound of lean mass. So for me, I do weigh about 100 kilograms. I weigh about 220 pounds. I think my fat-free mass is probably going to be about 170 pounds. So for me, 170 grams of protein is probably going to be a very sufficient level of protein consumption for me. I could go a little bit less, and I could do just fine. An implication for that is someone who is eating at maintenance calories, or especially someone who is eating above their maintenance calories. If you have, lots of carbohydrates and fats coming in for your body to utilize as energy, then those are actually going to be protein sparing. So if you are in an extreme deficit, you're trying to lose body fat, you're trying to lose weight, then your body might use proteins for energy. Some proteins get converted into lipid-like molecules that are used for fuel in that way. Most are used for something called gluconeogenesis, which is the creation of glucose. So when you're really, really stripped for food, you're not eating very much food, it's more likely that your body is going to use the protein that you eat in that regard. So you might actually need to eat more protein just because your body is kind of using protein in ways that you wish it wouldn't. If you're eating more carbs and more fats, more calories overall throughout your day, that's probably not as much of a concern for you, and you can actually get away with eating less protein. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, the RDA, the recommended daily allowance for protein, I want to say is zero point 0.6 to 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So like I said, I weigh about 100 kilograms. The RDA for me then would be to eat about 60 to 80 grams of protein. Now that is a third to a half of the recommendations that I've given to myself in these other contexts. But the RDA is simply set at how do I replenish the protein that my body is losing? And that is calculated through my nitrogen balance. How much nitrogen am I losing? Therefore, how much nitrogen do I need to take back in? Now, that is basically what you need to eat each day to not wither away, to maintain healthy organs. But our goal as athletes is not simply to have healthy organs and not wither away, but we want to be high performers. We want to be bigger, faster, stronger, and perform better. So definitely we're probably going to want to place an emphasis on having more protein than just the RDA. Again, 0.8 to 1 grams per pound is a pretty good guideline I would recommend to almost any athlete, assuming that most athletes as well are relatively lean. Let's say if you were 180 pounds, then you should be consuming probably about 160 to 180 grams of protein per day as my recommendation. And it's pretty simple math if you'd like to do that for whatever your body weight is and whatever your sport is. I don't really think that there needs to be much variation in how much protein you eat depending on your sport. Obviously, if someone is a bodybuilder, a power lifter, and really their sport is their muscles, then they might want to go even higher. And protein could definitely help you feel very full. However, it is also very expensive. And so a lot of budgets can't really accommodate super, super high amounts of protein. And so I do want you to know that you don't need to be worried if you can't, afford 250 grams of protein in a day. Protein is the most expensive macronutrient by all means. And so living at the lower end of that spectrum, again, especially if you're consuming plenty of carbs and fats and total calories in your day, is going to be totally fine. And then lastly, I want to talk about the hydration and electrolytes. Now, the easiest way to know exactly how much water and electrolytes you need to replenish post-exercise is actually just to weigh yourself before and after. Now, usually you'd probably want to do this in minimal amounts of clothing before and after, just because, if your shirt and your pants get soaked in sweat, then you're not really going to accurately be able to know how much sweat you lost, because you might be weighing it before when it's not in your clothes and after when it is in your clothes. So if you do this in more minimal clothing, that's probably going to get you a more accurate reading. And then you really just want to rehydrate with water to be equal to the amount of weight that you lost. So if you lost 2 pounds of body weight during your exercise, during your training, then you need to consume 2 pounds of water, which is going to be about a quart of water. In terms of electrolytes, again, I do have an episode all dedicated to water, hydration, electrolytes. So if you want to get a little bit more of a deep dive into those topics, I recommend you go listen to that. It's episode 7. However, there are pretty normal values for, average values for how much electrolytes we are losing in sweat. And that is going to be about 1,000 milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat, and I think just about 100 milligrams of potassium. These are all off the top of my head, so I apologize if they're incorrect. But we lose a little bit less electrolytes through sweat than what is physiologically normal for our body. If you want to, this might not be something that everyone wants to spend the money on, but there are actually devices used to calculate the electrolyte content of, it can measure that of urine, or it can measure that of sweat. So if you really, really, really want to take it seriously and recover as best as you can, then measure your own sweat with one of these, electrolyte fluid measurers. I'm sure you can just find them online and on Amazon. If you wanted to do that, then you could actually know exactly how much electrolytes you needed to replenish in accordance with your water. Now, obviously, the electrolytes that we lose are not really going to have much weight to them. So weigh yourself before and after exercise and replenish with that amount of water. And then Usually, for every liter of water, I would say you should be consuming about 1,000 milligrams. You could do a little more, you could do a little less of salt. Potassium, probably about 500 milligrams of potassium is what I would recommend, just because potassium is pretty underconsumed in a lot of contexts anyway. You can make it at home with just iodized table salt. Iodine is very, very good and also sort of underconsumed, so I do recommend iodized table salt. But then also they sell potassium salts, and you can put that in a water bottle with some drink mix, some Crystal Light or some Mayo or whatever you prefer. Or you can buy a pre-flavored Element or a liquid IV. As we talk about in the episode about hydration and electrolytes, things like Gatorade and Powerade actually don't have very many electrolytes in them. So unless you add a little bit of salt to them yourself, then you'd probably be better off going with other options that are more specified towards athletes. And with that is kind of all the nutritional advice that I have for you. I know that wasn't super, super condensed, but there we go. Those are your nutritional tools for recovery. With that, we are going to go into the recovery tools. What can I do in addition to good nutrition and rest to perhaps recover better? Now, before I actually start going into the individual examples, you should know that in a nutshell, the remainder of this episode is just talking about blood flow. Really, blood flow is the most meaningful thing that you can do to recover. Be that recovery from an injury, or be it just recovery from your exercise and your training. There's basically nothing that is going to have as big of an effect on your recovery as just getting blood flow. So I want you to think about that in your head as I go over all these different tools. Do these tools help deliver more blood flow to the muscles and to the tissues that are needing to recover? If so, they probably are good recovery tools. And if not, there's a good chance that they really are not that good. Not that they don't have any application, but really blood flow is what we are looking for. The first one I wanted to start with, just because it is so common, is massaging and the use of like foam rollers and things like that. There's all different ways that you could apply sort of that pressure and that massaging, but anything that falls into that category kind of is all going to fall under this category. Well, so for massaging and foam rollers, you should know that there really is not any difference in muscular blood flow that the research shows. Now, some of the research has shown that there is a difference in cutaneous blood flow, and that means the blood flow of the skin, which could sound promising, but it could actually be a bad thing to have an increase in cutaneous blood flow, because then that could mean that blood is being diverted away from the muscles and the tissues and to the skin. We don't really need to recover our skin as much as we need to recover our muscles and our tendons and ligaments and our tissues there. So there's not really an increase in blood flow, but then why do people massage? Why do people use foam rollers? And the answer really is just because it feels good. Now that can come about in a couple different ways. Now I will say, just for context, a lot of the studies that have been done on this are done where one person acts as their own control group. So what I mean by that is somebody will do, for example, a recovery technique on their left arm, but not on their right arm. And so there's going to be like no amount of genetic variation or difference in nutrition or difference in sleep, because it's the exact same person. The only difference is what's done on their left arm versus their right arm. So this is pretty reliable research that we can glean a lot of information and value from because of the study design. Now, I've already mentioned that there's really no difference in muscle blood flow, but there is difference that can be seen through massaging and foam rolling in things like pain relief and edema. Now, edema is the medical word for swelling. So, if you've sprained your ankle, it's probably swollen up. That is considered edema. But also just muscle tissue can have, increased amounts of fluid inside of it. It might not be as dramatic, but that is a form of edema. Now, massaging can elicit pain-relieving benefits because when you rub on the skin and on these tissues, basically it disrupts the pain signals that are being sent to the brain. So you're adding an additional sensation onto that, be it, say your legs. We'll use your legs as your example. You did squats or you did sprints, and so your legs are really sore. You're getting that sore sensation sent to your brain, but if you're able to rub on the skin and on those muscles that are sore, then you're sending this, sort of conflicting signal to the brain, and it's disrupting the pain signal. So it can be pain relieving in that regard. And then that pressure that you're putting onto the tissue, again, by means of your massage or your foam roller, whatever that might be, can actually increase the cellular pressure of the muscle cells. And then since they have that extra fluid, well, if there's more pressure on them, then they're going to be more likely to start pushing out that fluid back into the bloodstream, have a better fluid balance. And then if there's less fluid, there's less swelling. We've already talked about how that swelling of the muscle cells can kind of cause those soreness sensations. And so with that additional pressure, it might help promote the passing on of these fluids back into the bloodstream and kind of getting rid of that muscle soreness and things like that. Now, massaging and foam rolling might not be the most effective way to do that, to increase that cellular pressure and promote the fluid flowing away from those cells. Now, you might actually think that sounds bad, right? Because we've talked about how blood flow to the cell is beneficial. Now, if that's beneficial, we want fluid to the cell, then why would, as a recovery technique, we push fluid away from the cell? And well, if there's fluid pushed away from the cell, it actually makes room for new fluid and new blood to enter the cell that is better, it's more oxygenated, and it has less metabolites and waste products in it, and it has more fueling and recovery components in that new blood, that new fluid. So that could actually be very beneficial in that regard. What might be a lot better than simply massaging or foam rolling in terms of that cellular pressure and the edema is compression garments. So this is something that you might be familiar with or have seen people wear, is like a compression sock that goes up to the knee, covering the calf, is very, very common, especially for like a distance runner. And the reason for that is because there's something that is called distributive shock. Now, it can come across in a variety of ways, but an example that's pretty easy for me to visualize, at least, so I'll share it with you, is that of if someone has like a spinal cord injury. So they're paralyzed from be it the neck down or the waist down. Well, then their legs are not receiving signals or any sort of communication from the brain. Now, our blood vessels are all lined with smooth muscle, and that smooth muscle of the blood vessels can contract and relax, and that is what's going to help us maintain our blood pressure. If, however, somebody is not receiving any communication from their brain down to their legs, then that smooth muscle in the blood vessels is not going to receive any communication from the brain. And in most cases, it's just going to completely relax. The blood vessels are going to be completely dilated, which means, enlarged. They have a larger diameter. And because of that, the blood pressure is going to decrease, and there's going to be a lot of swelling, because if the blood pressure is low, then it's going to be harder for it to return back up the body to the heart, and a lot of that fluid is just going to kind of pool, with the help of gravity, in the legs and in the feet. It can also just happen as we age. The older we get, the weaker that smooth muscle in the blood vessel gets. So that is why people who might be paralyzed, as well as elderly individuals, might commonly have, swollen feet and ankles and calves, is for that reason. So what these people can do is wear something like a compression sock. Now, the compression sock is going to kind of externally contract those blood vessels a little bit. It's going to add a little bit of pressure, increasing the blood pressure, and that's actually going to help that blood return back up to the heart, return to recirculation. And compression socks can be very, very beneficial in that regard. Now, if you have a little bit of swelling in your feet and ankles and calves, it's probably a lot less because you don't have healthy, smooth muscle in your blood vessels. So it might not be a huge concern, and you might not need to get compression socks to fix it. However, the idea is still there. That increase in pressure can definitely help, as we hope to have fluid return into the heart, to return to circulation, and again, make room for that new fluid to come in to recover. So it could be a very beneficial tool if it's something that you feel like works for you. Personally, I have never really struggled with feeling like I have swelling, or at least excessive swelling, or improper amounts of blood flow. Granted, I don't do a lot of endurance sports, and that's really, like cross-country marathon runners are more so going to be the ones who are using these things. And so I have never really used them. I don't plan on using them. But if it's something, if I've been talking about this sort of edema and it really is kind of ringing with you, you're thinking, wow, like that's exactly me, I have those problems, then definitely I would recommend trying some sort of a compression sock. There's compression socks. There are compression garments for your arms and for your hands. And I think there are actually companies that make full body compression suits. In that case, that could actually be a good thing. I haven't really given it much thought until just this moment, but it could do a really good job at, sort of rerouting blood flow to the essential organs. However, that taken too far is actually kind of what shock is. Usually, when we go into shock, our blood vessels constrict very, very tightly. Adrenaline causes our blood vessels to constrict very tightly so that we have a lot of blood flow to the central organs. And then really it could just, keep the blood flow from coming back because it's just all being squeezed back to the organs. So I don't know about the efficacy of a full body compression suit, and I'm sure it's more expensive than most of us would want to spend on something like that, but I do believe it is an option if anyone wants to try it. But really what I think would be most beneficial is just something that goes over your arm or goes over all of or part of your legs. The next tool that I'd like to discuss is that of extreme cold. Now, usually this is going to be in the form of like an ice bath, some sort of a cold tub full of cold water, or it could be in the form of cryotherapy. Cryotherapy, I don't think it's quite as popular today as it was back when it kind of came out. It caught a lot of hype and got very, very popular at a certain time, but it is also very expensive. Most people are not going to be going to a cryotherapy salon or spa or whatever they want to call it. Most people are not going to have the money to buy their own. So usually the most common thing is just some sort of an ice bath. And even an ice bath can be more expensive than a lot of people would like to spend. So definitely, it's all the same though. It's extreme cold temperatures. How do extreme cold temperatures impact our recovery? Now, more so recently, and you might already be familiar with this, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you that the most recent research has kind of shown us that extreme cold actually blunts our body's responses to muscle damage and muscle recovery. So those beneficial processes that we want to be occurring in our muscles to get bigger and to get stronger and to get faster, to, have an improved body and athletic capability in response to our training, those processes that make that happen are blunted and slowed down due to extreme cold temperatures. So immediately, I'm probably not going to recommend them to you. Now, another thing that we've talked about is that of blood flow. Now, blood flow is really going to be the most important thing that we can do for our recovery, but cold actually decreases blood flow. Cold is vasoconstrictive, whereas heat promotes vasodilation. And that is actually just a body temperature regulation mechanism. But when we get extremely cold, our blood vessels tighten down, and that can actually decrease our blood flow. Now, I've talked about with the compression garments that it increases our blood flow in a beneficial way for like edema to increase our blood pressure, but that is a different case. That is, again, when we're experiencing like excessive swelling and things like that. Compression garments might be indicated in those sorts of scenarios. However, if that's not the case, and under normal circumstances, at least for many healthy athletes, young athletes, then a constriction of the blood vessels is going to decrease blood flow, and that is not going to be very desirable. It can also be anti-inflammatory, but that could be not good either. Sometimes that inflammation response is exactly what we want because it helps, as I've said, our body make meaningful progress and meaningful recovery that improves our athletic capability in response to our training. Now, Extreme cold can actually, in the same way that I mentioned about the massaging and the foam rolling, it can actually decrease pain. It can be sort of a painkiller. And if you've ever taken an ice bath, I think you immediately are going to know what I mean. But it is kind of a shock to your skin. And, your skin kind of like hurts a little bit, at least if you're new to it, right? You get in this extremely cold bath, and it's really like an overwhelming thing, and it kind of sends this, very, very cold sensation, obviously, to your skin and to your brain. And just as I've mentioned with the massage, that is going to kind of compete with the signals that are being sent to the brain of pain. So it can definitely be a pain-relieving thing to engage in this cryotherapy or ice baths for that reason. However, it's just not something that we really want to do if our goal is to improve post-training, right? So if you go to the gym, you're doing strength training or power training or speed training or whatever, you're going to get sore, you're going to get tired, you're going to get fatigued, you're going to have these breakdown and these different tissues and things like that. The goal of that is not just to break down and get tired, but it is to recover from that and get better. And the physiological processes that make that happen are blunted in response to cold. So it is not something I recommend doing, at least in close proximity to our training. Now, I know that lots of people like to do cold water immersion and things for other benefits like, discipline and mental rigor, and some people who are very, very energized. That is because of a release of catecholamines like adrenaline or epinephrine. Those things can be very, very desirable benefits for, these extreme cold temperatures. If that is something that you are hoping to get out of it, then the best piece of advice that I can give you is to, first of all, not do it at least immediately after your exercise. At the very least, you should be waiting until several hours after, or really what I would probably recommend is to do it, maybe in the morning, first thing upon waking up, and then you go train perhaps a couple hours later in the day. That really, at that point, should not be blunting any sort of recovery response, at least in a meaningful way. The other thing you could do is just to take a cold shower. Now, in the literature of, getting these benefits from, or getting these effects and anti-inflammatory effects from these extreme cold temperatures, usually a cold shower is actually not quite cold enough, and it doesn't make sustained contact with your skin for long enough to actually have those anti-inflammatory effects and things like that. But if you've ever taken a cold shower, it is probably going to be cold enough and be in contact with your skin long enough to signal, that get that fight or flight response going and release the adrenaline into your body and kind of give you the results for, discipline as well as mental vigor that you are looking for out of this extreme cold temperature. So if that is something you're looking to do, that is what I would recommend. Now, that anti-inflammatory effect could actually have some indications, times that we might want that effect and we might want to do things like a cold bath. But I'm going to talk about that in just a minute when I talk about anti-inflammatory drugs. In the meantime, it feels fitting after talking about extreme cold to talk about extreme heat. That could be hot tub or it could be sauna. I think those are going to be the two common ways to expose your body to extreme heat. And frankly, heat and sauna and things like that are my favorite recovery modality because, again, as we've already mentioned, as a thermal regulation technique in our body, hot temperatures cause our blood vessels to dilate or get a larger diameter, increasing blood flow. Heat increases blood flow improves recovery capabilities. Now, of all the different recovery modalities, the research points to this one being the best. If you are hoping to recover, hot tubbing and sauna to get this vasodilation is really, really probably going to be your best bet. The other thing about it, though, is that it does still kind of stress the body. And when our body experiences stress, we are going to see an increase in things like growth hormone, growth factors, and testosterone. These chemicals and hormones and compounds in our body that are going to be very desirable in terms of getting bigger, faster, stronger. When our body experiences stress, it is common to release these hormones because your body is trying to protect itself and to recover and to have the tools that it needs to do well. And so heat and sauna is going to improve blood flow, and it can actually improve things like growth hormone and testosterone, which are very desirable in terms of our recovery. Now, let's talk about these anti-inflammatory drugs next. Anti-inflammatory drugs are probably going to have a very similar effect on your recovery to extreme cold. Extreme cold is anti-inflammatory. Obviously, anti-inflammatory drugs are anti-inflammatory. You're commonly going to see these written as NSAIDs or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAID, NSAIDs. Probably the most common one that athletes are going to be taking if they are feeling sore or tired or achy after exercise or anything like that is going to be like ibuprofen or Advil. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about as this goes, but there are definitely other varieties of these NSAIDs. Well, the way that these NSAIDs work is that they block the production of something called cyclooxygenase, or that is abbreviated as COX, C-O-X. Now, there's different types of COX enzymes, but what this COX is that it is a precursor to something called a prostaglandin, which is inflammatory. And so when we take these non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, they're going to block the release, or the production, I should say, of these inflammatory hormones. Now, really, athletes should not be taking NSAIDs super regularly anyways. If you're having some, even just 200 to 400 milligrams of ibuprofen daily, that's not something I'm going to recommend that you do every single day, but I know that some athletes do. But you should know that these prostaglandins that are inflammatory, they do have other roles in the body, including the mucous membrane of the stomach, which is why sometimes if people are taking too much of these NSAIDs or ibuprofen or aspirin, it can actually lead to getting a stomach ulcer because these prostaglandins that are being blocked play a role in the production of the mucus lining for the stomach, where the mucus lining is going to recede back and the stomach acid can actually burn the stomach and cause ulcers. So for that case, it's already probably not a great idea for athletes to be dependent on these NSAIDs, but these prostaglandins can actually be very, very desirable in the post-exercise recovery sense. Now, these prostaglandins can actually signal to the body to release stem cells and satellite cells. It can signal for a lot of physiologically beneficial processes to occur that are going to lead to us getting bigger, faster, and stronger. Same with cold, NSAIDs, it's the same exact thing. This inflammation can actually be good in these post-exercise recovery senses. A lot of people just hear inflammation and it's a buzzword to them. But inflammation is not always bad. Yeah, if we're over-inflamed, that's going to be bad. But you don't just want no amounts of inflammation. And especially in the context of post-exercise recovery, inflammation is going to be pretty desirable in a lot of ways. And if we blunt that response to the use of things like NSAIDs, then we're not going to be recovering to the way that we want to. So this is actually going to be bad for post-exercise recovery. Now, again, this is something that's gotten a lot more traction recently, so it might be an idea that you're already familiar with. But things like cold and NSAIDs are just not going to be desirable for post-exercise recovery. Now, when they might be beneficial for is after an athletic event or after a game. Some great examples of this are, first of all, like a baseball pitcher. We know that the pitcher in baseball, obviously there's a lot of strain on the shoulder joint of the pitcher. And so a lot of pitchers are only given a certain time window to be the pitcher, and then they get traded out so that they don't, injure their shoulder, and they always try and take, as best care as they possibly can to recover their shoulder. Another good example is like if you've ran a marathon or an ultra marathon, well, then that is your performance day. That kind of exceeds any sort of a, an exercise response that you got during training, and now that was your race day, you're all done, and now you're probably going to be feeling pretty tired and miserable and sore, and you're going to want to recover from that just so you can get back to your normal life. And another great example is that of things like contact sports like football, or combat sports like MMA or boxing, things where you might actually be injured. Then something like cold water immersion and NSAIDs can actually be very, very beneficial in this context because, well, you've done something that goes beyond your normal training stimulus, and so you want to get back. You want to get off of the soreness and the fatigue, and again, in some cases, the injuries that have occurred during this race day or game day, and you want to actually be able to just get back into your training. So cold baths and ibuprofen, after you've competed or after your race day, I think could actually be very, very beneficial just so that you can kind of reset and get back to your baseline so that you can pick up your training where you left off instead of being exceptionally or in some cases uniquely sore post game day, post race day. So although these things should be avoided in conjunction with training, in conjunction with performance, and game day performance, it could be very, very beneficial. Now, lastly, a couple recovery modalities that I wanted to just give a little bit of light to, not spend quite as much time on, but these are going to be cupping therapy, the use of Icy Hot, stretching, and then EMS, which is Electromyostimulation. These, in a nutshell, are not really going to do anything for your recovery. Now, cupping, the idea behind it is that it increases blood flow. And cupping, if you're not familiar, is you take a low-pressure cup. There's a variety of different ways to do it. Sometimes they warm the air inside of the cup with like a candle or some sort of a flame. And so then you place it on the person's skin, and then as it cools down, the volume of that air will contract, the pressure will go down, and it will pull in the skin and the tissue into that cup. You can also just use will have like a vacuum pump attached to them that you can use to decrease the pressure and pull that tissue into the cup. Now, the idea, it kind of makes sense. If there's less pressure and that tissue's being pulled in there, perhaps it will cause some amount of vasodilation to those areas. However, also if you've ever done cupping or seen someone do cupping, it's not really like a full body thing that you can get. It's usually just in a couple spots on your back and your arms, your shoulder, your legs. And it's really not going to help with your recovery in a meaningful way. It's going to be very similar to massaging. However, the thing with massaging is that you can actually cover, your entire back, your entire legs, and not just these few areas. A lot of people don't really like the cupping scars either. I don't think I'll ever do cupping for that reason. But some people just like the way it feels. And if you like the way it feels, it's within your budget that you'd like to do it because it feels good, then that's great. I'm not saying that you shouldn't. It's not necessarily bad to do cupping. But to the people that just wish they could afford to do cupping because they're sore and they're fatigued and they just feel like it would really, really help their recovery, you're probably not missing out on as much as you think you are. The next one is the use of Icy Hot. This is very, very common mainly for injuries. I have it, I use it. Sometimes I've tweaked my back, or just if you sleep wrong and so your back kind of has an ache or whatever it might be, then Icy Hot can be, a great tool to help kind of alleviate that pain. But all it is pain relief. The active ingredient in Icy Hot is menthol, and the menthol is just going to kind of send, again, this cool, contrasting sensation to the brain and get rid of some of this pain that you feel in conjunction with whatever sprain or strain or injury that you might have. Now, the benefit of that, especially if you compare it to ibuprofen, ibuprofen is anti-inflammatory, which is going to inhibit the recovery responses, whereas Icy Hot is not. And then it's a lot easier to apply Icy Hot, to yourself than to get a massage. It's, much cheaper than a professional massage, especially. So I think Icy Hot definitely could be a great tool, something to have with you in case you do feel achy and sore and you want to get a little bit of pain relief. But, to my knowledge, there's not any reason that it would actually impact your recovery efficacy in the same way that like cold or especially something like ibuprofen would. The next one I wanted to talk about was just stretching. Now, stretching, again, it feels good. It's kind of you're moving and lengthening and shortening the muscle, which can be good, and in some cases can promote some blood flow, so it could be good. But, I mean, if you're trying to stretch as a method of like tissue recovery, it's probably not going to do a lot. It might help with a little bit of the edema. It might get rid of a little bit of the delayed onset muscle soreness that we've talked about. However, in terms of actually like, muscle protein synthesis and, tissue improvements and strengthening, again, bigger, faster, stronger, stretching is probably not going to do much. Stretching might be something that you want to do to increase your flexibility and hopefully decrease your risk of injury. However, this episode is just about recovery and fatigue management. If it feels good, you should do it. It's a great thing to warm up, to get ready for your exercise, just to get your muscles ready to perform. We could go into a separate conversation about that. You probably shouldn't do long distance, long duration static stretching as you're getting ready for exercise, something like a dynamic stretch, or if you are going to do some sort of a static stretch, try and just keep it to a short duration for the sake of your performance, because if you're doing prolonged stretching, then that mechanical tension, although it might not be mechanical tension, I apologize, that tension on the muscle is similar to the mechanical tension that we hope to cause to occur during our exercise, and so it could actually just weaken the muscle. The research does show that it can decrease muscular performance if you are stretching too much. If you're trying to go on like a long run, it's probably not going to matter so much, right? Because that's not so much worried about your muscular strength and power. And, I definitely like to give my muscles a good stretch before I go on a run. But anyways, stretching. The last one is EMS, electromyostimulation. That is the use of an external machine to send the electrical impulses to your muscles to cause them to contract rather than your brain. And I don't have much to say on this because, not a lot of research has been done, but they're expensive. They, I feel like they probably have a fair amount of user error. And the research that does exist on them really kind of shows that there's no meaningful recovery impacts on this electromyostimulation. Then the last thing that I wanted to talk about before we get into sleep and then some real protocols for our recovery is the idea of active versus passive recovery. Now, in all of the studies that I've kind of shown you at this point, passive recovery really is the control. Like I said, in all of these different recovery modalities, what we're trying to find out is, do we get a benefit in addition to just good nutrition and good rest? And so passive recovery really is the baseline. However, I'm sure a lot of you have heard a lot about active recovery. And active recovery is great. It improves blood flow. It gets the heart beating a little bit. You're using the muscles, and that really is going to help with blood flow, nutrient delivery to the muscles and tissues, and then the delivery of waste products away from the muscle and tissues that have been used during exercise and during training. However, there are just some stipulations. I will say the research shows that active recovery is beneficial with a few caveats. Now, one example of a study I looked at is one that was done, I believe, out of the United Kingdom. They were looking at hockey players, and they wanted to see whether active or passive recovery was better for their recovery post-training. Now, hockey, it's kind of a contact sport, right? And so there is the risk of actual injuries and actual muscle damage and bruising and things like that. And so, on the one hand, it might be more beneficial for these athletes to do things like cold water immersion and take NSAIDs. However, all the same principles are going to apply with recovery. Is active recovery or passive recovery going to be better for these hockey players to perform better? Now, what they found is they kind of tested a variety of ranges on what level of active recovery is going to be best. And what they found was that 28% of the VO2 max was the best spot for active recovery. Now, a lot of us have never had our VO2 max tested. and wouldn't really know how to perform at 28% of our VO2 max, even if we did know what our VO2 max was. That is an obvious stipulation. That's really a measure and a number that you can only obtain as well as actually put into practice at some sort of an exercise physiology lab to hit that exact 28% of your VO2 max. But really 28% of your VO2 max is going to be just not super active, right? You're going to be not, resting. You're really, what it looks like for most people is probably just like a brisk walk, a little bit of a jog sometimes, but that's probably more so if you are pretty fit. For most people, it's just going to be like a brisk walk. If you're doing, if you want to get some active recovery for your upper body, something like just throwing a football or a frisbee around could be good. Doing like a little bit of a swim, just really it's just activity. You don't want to go overboard though. The risk that comes when you go overboard is that is going to impair our glycogen muscle resynthesis, because if we're being too active, we're going to kind of use up some of the glycogen that's being reformed in our muscles, and then it's actually kind of just eat away at the glycogen we're hoping to use for our next training session. I'd say when in doubt, you should probably go a little bit lower and lighter and easier on your active recovery than you think you need to. In fact, some people get this idea with active recovery that they need to be doing more active recovery, and just they think, well, I want to recover better from exercise. What more can I do? What can I add? What can I do? And in a lot of cases, I love the energy behind that you are super excited to do as much as you can to be great at your sport. But in a lot of cases, you probably need to be doing less. Really, sleep and rest are what is really going to be the biggest drivers of muscle recovery, tissue recovery for sports. And with that, let's move into our topic about sleep. Now, my discussion and my instruction to you right now about sleep are going to be kind of rudimentary. Now, I don't think I'll probably ever do a solo episode about sleep, just because, definitely it is super important for sports performance. It is a science, and so it would be fitting to be on the science of sports performance. But it's just not something that I am an expert in, nor do I think I'm really ever going to become an expert in it, because it really is more involved in the field of neurology and the brain. And so if you are looking for a much more in-depth tutorial about sleep tools and how to get better sleep, a great resource that I'm sure many of you listeners are familiar with, if not all, is going to be the Huberman Lab podcast. Andrew Huberman is a neuroscientist, and so he knows a lot about the brain and has some great podcasts that I have listened to and recommend to anybody about sleep. He also has, if you really want to get into it, a multi-episode mini-series with Dr. Matt Walker, who is a scientist who has devoted his entire career to sleep. So if you really want to get into the weeds about sleep, then I would highly recommend those resources. But I'm just going to highlight some of the basic principles that you can employ to get the best sleep and the best rest that you can. Now, the first one I think is just time, the duration, right? Many athletes don't take this seriously. I know a lot of athletes who, and I've been this way at certain points in my life, where you're trying to eat the best that you can and trying to train the best that you can, but then you get 6 or 7 hours of sleep every night, sometimes less. And I know that there's lots and lots of different things that can affect it. Family stress, you have life events going on, social events, and all these different things, school or in the morning classes and work. But really, you really need to avoid the temptation to just get pretty bad sleep and then just take a bunch of caffeine to offset your feelings of fatigue throughout the day, because this sleep is super important. In fact, sleep, nutrition, and exercise are going to be the 3 main pillars of health. So I want you to take your sleep just as seriously as you would take your training, just as seriously as you would take your nutrition. The most basic principle, as I just mentioned, is the duration. If you can get 8 hours of sleep, that is going to be a huge benefit for you. Now, some people don't like that idea. I've heard, videos of, people saying if you want to be rich and successful, you can't sleep 8 hours a day. That's too much time. Sleep faster. Just sleep, a couple hours each night and then just keep working all the rest of the day. If that's really how they want to live their life, I think that's fine. But if your goal is to be healthy, and definitely if your goal is to be the best performing athlete you can be, you need to take those 8 hours of sleep. Now, some tools to get high quality 8 hours of sleep, because really 6 hours of good sleep is better than 8 hours of bad sleep. To get really, really good sleep, the first thing you should think about is your body temperature. Now, your body temperature changes for you to experience the onset of sleep. Your body temperature cools down. And so there's different things that you can do, first of all, within your own body to try and limit your own body temperature and keep it from rising, is to avoid things like exercise and large meals right before bed, because those could, obviously just increase your body temperature and make it so that you kind of struggle to experience that onset of sleep. Something that you can also do is to take a hot bath or a hot shower, or as I've already mentioned, I love sauna and hot tub for recovery. If you do something like that, it's actually going to kind of signal to your body that it needs to, put in place those practices to cool down. That could be sweating, and I understand that probably a lot of you don't want to start sweating right before you go to bed, but also just the vasodilation that I've already mentioned is a thermoregulation technique. So your body's going to start cooling itself down when you are in a hot environment. And so doing something like that, in the hours leading up to bed could definitely help you with that sleep onset. But then another thing, of course, that you can do is just sleep in a cold room. So have the AC on, have the fan blowing on you so that the room is cool. And then that is obviously going to help your body temperature lower as well. In terms of light, that is something that it's very easy to manipulate in your sleep environment, the amount of light. So getting just like a blackout curtain for your window, turning off, any things like alarm clocks or things that have these bright lights in your room that might be bothering you. But then another one, and again, I'm guilty of it personally, but so many people need to do better at this, is the phone. The phone really is sending enough light to your eyeballs to think that it's daytime and it's a bright source of light that if you want to have better sleep, you should be avoiding so that you can sleep as best as you can, get that high quality sleep, fall asleep quickly, stay deeply asleep, enter into REM sleep. Another thing that you can do to really, really get good sleep is to breathe through your nose. Nasal breathing at sleep is really, really beneficial because what it actually does, well, first of all, is it stimulates your vagus nerve, which is going to help you calm down and relax. The other thing is that inside of your nose are these structures called turbinates. And turbinates are just these really vascular structures within your nasal cavity that are going to help warm and humidify the air that you breathe. And so it's going to help you just be more relaxed and breathe easier and better throughout the night. And so with those two reasons combined, nasal breathing is really, really going to help you get some good sleep. Now, it's very common, you see all over the internet nowadays, nose strips, those things that you use to open up your nose so that you can nose breathe easier. They definitely can be very, very, very good. A lot of times I see people wearing these nose strips like in the gym and on a run, and in those cases, your goal is not to relax. Your goal is not to stimulate your vagus nerve and be in a calm, relaxed mood. The goal in that case is actually to exercise, especially if you're at the gym. You kind of want to be riling yourself up to lift more weight and increase your muscular power. And so I always think it's kind of goofy. I don't think there's anything wrong with mouth breathing during exercise and at the gym. However, at nighttime, they can be very, very good. I actually used to wear nose strips all the time, every single night, because I heard about them, I wanted to try them, and I loved the way that they helped me breathe through my nose better. But eventually, I found out that I had a pretty badly deviated septum, and that was the reason I couldn't breathe well through my nose. Now, obviously, the surgery for that is more expensive probably than just buying nose strips every now and again, but if I had to just speak from my own personal experience, I would recommend getting the septoplasty surgery so that you can breathe better through your nose. Since that surgery, my recovery from that surgery, I have not had to use nose strips at all. And I can breathe great through my nose, and I sleep really, really, really well now. Another thing about sleep that I would tell you guys about is that there are some people who, just really, really struggle to go to bed early. Maybe they have to wake up at a certain hour in the day. They can't just sleep in late into the morning. But then, when it comes time that they'd like to go to bed to get that 8 hours of sleep, they just don't feel like they're sleepy. I don't fall asleep for, an hour or two after when I ought to be going to bed. I'm just not sleepy. I can't fall asleep. And so because I have to wake up at this certain time, I can't get my 8 hours of sleep. The best tool to do in that case is to wake up earlier and get less sleep. Now, that sounds crazy. Hopefully you don't have to do this for more than a day or 2 or 3. But say that you have to wake up at 7 o'clock, and so you wish that you could be going to bed at 11, but you don't fall asleep. You don't feel sleepy until midnight or 12:30. Hopefully it's not something like 1 a.m., but it could even be that late. But when you try to go to bed at 11, you just can't fall asleep, and you have to wake up at 7 o'clock anyway. What you should do is fall asleep at midnight or 1 a.m., whenever it is that you do feel sleepy, and set an alarm. Wake yourself up at 5:30 a.m. And then, again, like I said, throughout that day, try not to just go overboard on the caffeine, but then at the end of the day, what's going to happen is you're going to be pooped. You're going to be super, super tired, and you're going to go to bed a little bit earlier. Now, try and keep that up for a couple days so that you are falling asleep at that time that you'd like to go to bed consistently. And then from there, you'll be able to sleep in until the time that you have to wake up anyway, which is 7. Eventually, after a few nights of that, hopefully you are falling asleep at 11 and waking up at 7. Getting those good habits involved. And really a consistent sleep schedule night to night is really going to be one of the best things you can do. With all that, that is all of the content that I have, kind of all these tools and this information for you. So I want to all wrap it up very neatly with a bow. We've talked about all these different recovery modalities. So what? What should we do? Well, my personal recommendation, according to all the literature that I reviewed in preparation for this episode, and in accordance with everything that we know, is going to be this. Say that you had your practice or your aerobic or your strength training workout, whatever it is that you want to recover from. Well, the first priority is going to be consume a high carb and a high protein meal, as well as to rehydrate with water and electrolytes. Those things are going to set the foundation for everything else that happens here. If you don't have carbs and protein and water and sodium and potassium, the electrolytes that you need, you're not going to recover well. So step 1 is your nutrition. High carb, high protein, high water and electrolyte meal post-exercise. Step 2 is going to be heat therapy, whether you prefer sauna or whether you prefer hot tubbing. Now, if you are a male, there is some evidence that extreme heat could actually lower a male's sperm count, and so it is common practice to kind of put some sort of a cold, an ice pack or something on the testicles so that they are not affected by the extreme heat environment that you are in. But do that or don't, whatever you prefer, whatever stage of life that you are in. But that can definitely be an implication for heat therapy. But heat therapy is awesome. Vasodilation effects are incredible. Blood flow. We've talked about the growth hormone and testosterone release from the stress response. Heat therapy is going to be my step number 2. Step number 3 is going to be some sort of active recovery. And again, this is not very hard. Probably don't need to do very much of it, but definitely active recovery helps with blood flow, and it can really, really help with delayed onset muscle soreness as well. And if you're sore, you might not be performing as best as you hope to do in the next practice or exercise that you have. So for all those reasons, step 3 is active recovery. Step 4 is going to be stuff like massage or compression garments as needed. Now, that is really just for if you're experiencing that delayed onset muscle soreness and you want to get, have those pain relieving effects so that the muscle soreness goes away and that you can perform just from the sake of, pain relief, then massaging, foam rolling, compression garments, and things like that as needed for pain and muscle soreness is step number 4. And step number 5 is sleep. Get high quality sleep in accordance with the tools that I have laid out for you just previously. And then things like extreme cold exposure, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. You need to be saving those things for game day, race day, injury recovery, and things like that. If you have this, extreme performance day that is not your typical training, usually that means a game day or a race day, then the cold exposure and the anti-inflammatory over-the-counter medicine can definitely be a great tool for you to get back to your baseline so you can get back in the swing of your training. However, they should not be things that you are routinely doing. If you are interested in the deliberate cold exposure for building your mental fortitude and discipline, or just, increasing your body's response of catecholamines and, adrenaline, epinephrine, then what I'd recommend is a cold shower, because it's probably not going to be so cold that it blunts your body's, exercise recovery response, but it probably is going to be enough that it signals your fight or flight and you get those benefits that you were hoping for. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me on today's episode. Today's episode is actually episode 10 of the Science of Sports Performance. I heard at some point a statistic that, frankly, I have no idea the validity of it, but I've heard that most podcasts who start never make it past episode 10. I guess I haven't made it past episode 10 either at this point, but I have full intentions to, and so that puts me in the minority in a good way of podcasts, I suppose. I love making this podcast. I think all of you guys who are joining me today and the past and in the future episodes that are to come, I plan on being in this game for a long time, but I think that's very exciting. I learned a lot making this, and so I was really glad to do it, but I hope you guys got a lot out of this as well. Guys, if you are enjoying the things that you are learning on this podcast, there are some great ways that you can support and help this podcast grow. The first is to like the episode on YouTube, or you can follow and rate the show on whatever platform you listen to, Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts. You can subscribe to the show on YouTube. If you have any comments or questions, suggestions for future episodes, guests, or topics, please leave those in the comment section on YouTube. I do read all of the comments, and I love to hear from you guys and what your suggestions are for this show going forward. As well as you can share this episode or this show with a friend who you think might enjoy it. I do offer nutrition and exercise coaching. If you'd like to learn more about that, you can find my contact information in the show notes or in the description. That is obviously a for-cost way to support this podcast, but it does obviously support me and help me make this podcast. It's just something that I do because I love sports performance, I love nutrition, and I love exercise physiology. I want to share high quality information about these topics with everyone who's willing to listen. And that includes you today. Thank you for taking the time to listen. It really does mean a lot to me. Thank you for joining us today on the Science of Sports Performance.